Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think our speaker, Dr. Ido Baum, doesn't need much introduction in this forum. Ido is a friend of USA for Israeli Democracy, a constant contributor both on the webinar series and on the website. Ido is known for both his academic and journalistic work to defend democracy and human rights in Israel. And we invite him to tell us what's going on, and is the war on democracy the only front that the Netanyahu government is actually winning? Ido, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you, Oz, and thank you for having me. And good evening from Tel Aviv, from Israel. I guess if you're following the news, you know that Israel is in the middle of a war. I think we should be aware of the fact that this war has three fronts. There's a war in Gaza. There are hostilities going on in the north of Israel with Hezbollah that are 2-3 notches below a full-fledged war, but we should take this also into consideration. And we have a long-distance war with Iran. If you've been in a long-distance relationship, you probably know that it has a real effect on your life, even if it is long distance. But if you visit the center of Israel, you will see that life seems to be going on as usual. People are, going on with their lives. Democracy looks as if it's functioning. Protests aside, or protests included, we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is an illusion. This is an illusion. I think every individual in Israel today knows someone who died on October 7th or after October 7th. Three of my own law students, three wonderful young women were murdered in the Nova Festival, and we all pray for the return of those who were kidnapped by Hamas. And I think every individual in Israel is experiencing a very high level of anxiety, of distress, of fear, and of grief. But on the other hand, there are many people, fundamentalists, who feel that Israel is in a moment that is an opportunity of a lifetime. And this is a highly flammable mix of emotions, of nationalism, and of fundamentalism. And in that sense, this moment is a godsend to everyone who wishes to incite and to polarize and to diminish the democratic integrity of the state of Israel. So if you think of democracy as something that requires a minimal ideological liberal common denominator and a lot of tolerance, I think we're losing both. I was invited to brief you today about the state of democracy. I'll try to do that. I'll try to do that by drawing a picture from a lot of anecdotes and trying to understand them in the end, bring them all together to a distinct picture. I'm sure you all remember that before October 7th, our primary concern was the judicial overhaul. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, after October 7th, assured us all that this overhaul has been halted. This assurance is false. This assurance was misleading. Israel's democratic backslide continues, but it transformed in various ways. So let me briefly remind you, first of all, what were the key pillars of the judicial overhaul, so we understand how the transformation continues to promote the ideas behind this judicial overhaul. The first pillar was the reduction, if not the complete abolishment of the power of the Supreme Court to scrutinize the government actions, and the Knesset legislation. You can recall that Israel has a very deficient system of separation of powers, of balance of powers, that the court in Israel is actually, the Supreme Court is actually the last and only check on government power, on the executive branch. The public opposition during the judicial overhaul was at least partially successful in this context, in this pillar of the judicial overhaul. Last July, if you remember, almost a year ago, Netanyahu's coalition passed a basic law that abolished the reasonableness standards, so that the court would not be able to review government decisions, even if they were extremely unreasonable. And in the landmark decision that was handed down by the Supreme Court in its full panel, a historic full panel, last January, the Supreme Court struck down that basic law and revived the reasonableness standard. But let me also remind you that in March 2023, more than a year ago, Netanyahu's coalition passed another amendment to the basic law. That one makes it very difficult to remove the prime minister from office, not only in cases of criminal investigations of the prime minister, or undermining democracy, or violating legal obligations that he's made, but also even if he's just very sick or mentally disabled in one way or another. And the Supreme Court did not strike this down. It only decided that this basic law will come into force. It was postponed. It will come into force only after the next elections in the next Knesset. This was the first pillar. The second pillar was basically the political takeover of the Judicial Appointments Committee. This was particularly focused on the committee because the idea was to control the composition of the Supreme Court and ensure that the Supreme Court will be politically aligned with the ideology of the current coalition. And the third pillar was basically politicizing the public administration, the public service. Particularly, the efforts were focused on controlling and politicizing the role of legal advisors and the attorney general. You can basically reduce the idea of the judicial overhaul to these three pillars. Now, the judicial overhaul began with a blitz of legislation by the coalition, and this approach has changed, not abandoned, but this approach has changed. A more subtle tactic, I would say, has emerged, focusing on appointments and on politicizing key strongholds, institutions within the public administration of the State of Israel. I think the key strategy now is appointing enablers and weakening the watchdogs. Take the police. Take the police, for example. It's a very important institution. The Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has been fostering a sort of twisted competition, a very competitive atmosphere in the top echelon of the police among those district commissioners who want to be the next chief of police. And Ben-Gvir was seeking basically someone who would enforce a very strong-handed policy against pro-democracy protesters, while at the same time show leniency towards settlers. And this is his political base, of course. And indeed, what we saw is the result was increasing reports. This was, for example, exposed in the New York Times recently, on violent behavior by settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank, with very lax police enforcement, obviously. This situation has become so severe that some countries, including the United States and the EU, have imposed sanctions on some of the individuals allegedly connected with these activities in the settlements. On the other hand, the Israeli police is becoming more and more aggressive in the protests against the government that occur every week, almost every week and every weekend. And every weekend, these protests end with casualties, including wounded, mostly wounded, including among the members of the families of those who were kidnapped to Gaza. And eventually, you should know that Ben Gvir actually announced his choice for the next chief of police. We're talking about appointments now. So this person is Avshalom Peled, and he's the current deputy chief of the police. But Peled owes his career advancement to Ben Gvir. Let me tell you a little bit about Peled. This was exposed by Haaretz a few years ago. Peled was investigated for corruption, and the Ministry of Justice unit that is responsible for investigating police officers recommended against his promotion, and nevertheless he remained in the force despite this recommendation. And if it were not for Ben Gvir, Peled would never become a candidate for chief of police, let alone the actual choice. This appointment clearly shows that Ben Gvir intends to control the police and have the chief of police at his beck and call. I should say, though, that this appointment is not final. I think it would probably reach the Supreme Court, as everything does, because the Supreme Court is the only backstop in the Israeli democracy today. It's too soon to predict what would be the outcome of a challenge to the appointment of Peled, but you can definitely feel the effects of the process that Ben Gvir is promoting on the ground. But the police are just one example. All institutions that you would expect in Israel to be rigorously independent and professional are at risk. Consider the Shin Bet, the Shabak, the Israeli security services. According to Haaretz last week, the coalition during the judicial overhaul tried to ask the head of the Shabak, Ronen Bar, to use the abilities of the Shin Bet in order to track the opponents of the judicial overhaul. And the head of the Shabak, Ronen Bar, who was and still is the head of the Shabak, the Shin Bet, refused to do so, and rightly so. But now Ronen Bar is very likely to resign very soon. Ronen Bar was the head of the Shin Bet during the October 7th attack. I should say that of all the heads of intelligence units in Israel, Ronen Bar was actually the only one who felt, after hearing about the initial information on the evening of October 6th, that he needs to take action. He actually took some action to mitigate the potential attack on Israel, but this wasn't enough. And he also took responsibility, which Netanyahu never did, for the overall intelligence failure on October 7th. So obviously he is very likely to retire. He announced that he will. And obviously the government is just waiting for this to happen because his resignation will open the gates for the appointment of a Shin Bet head that would be more compliant and enabling in in the way that the government is going to go forward. And if you don't believe this, if you don't believe that this is happening, you should look to the States and to the testimony of former head of the FBI, James Comey, on his first meeting with the then newly elected President Donald Trump. At that first meeting, the first question that Donald Trump asked Comey, according to his testimony, was, "Will you be loyal to me?" Let's talk about the media. Another example of an appointment of a person in order to take over an institution just happened with the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation, Kan, Tagid HaShidur. This corporation is basically the Israeli version of the BBC. So it's supposed to be an independent media institution that supplies information to the public, that broadcasts news, that holds the government to account. And in order to guarantee all that, the government broadcasting corporation is supposed to be, detached from political control. So the law on how to appoint the board of directors of the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation is supposed to achieve that. It's a very intricate law. It basically says that the board will be appointed by a committee, and the committee itself will be appointed by the chair of that committee. And the chair of that committee will be appointed by the government, but it must be at least a district court judge, a retired district court judge. Whoever wrote this law assumed that judges are apolitical and impartial. Big mistake. What this government has done was choosing a retired judge who is openly aligned with Netanyahu's coalition, who has openly said that other commercial TV news channels should not be trusted. And this guy will basically appoint the entire leadership and supervisory body of the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation. So I suspect that it is just a matter of time now before what we see is a corporation that becomes a mouthpiece for the current coalition. Where political appointments are met with resistance, then the tactic of the government is simply to refrain from appointing anyone. So let's talk about the Judicial Appointments Committee. The Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, avoided appointing judges for over a year. And actually, it was only after October 7th, under the threat of a potential court order, that he agreed to finally convene the Judicial Appointments Committee, despite the fact that at the time, there were more than 100 vacancies, judicial vacancies, out of approximately 800 judges in Israel. So more than 10% of the vacancies were waiting to be filled. He didn't want to convene the committee. Why? Because Levin and the coalition politicians are at the moment a minority in the Judicial Appointments Committee. That was another successful result of the protests against and the opposition against the judicial overall. And Levin, Minister Levin and the coalition have only, at the moment, 3 seats out of 9 in the Judicial Appointments Committee. Now, still, Levin controls the committee's agenda. That is what the law states. So he decides who is going to be brought for discussion and who is actually nominated and appointed for judicial positions. And he is determined to appoint only judges who align with his views, aiming to politicize the Supreme Court. Since the retirement of two liberal judges from the Supreme Court, former Chief Justice Esther Chayut and Justice Anat Baron, last October, the Supreme Court has had two open seats, open vacancies, and no president, no permanent president, only a substitute president for almost a year now. And Levine refuses to appoint a new Chief Justice because he wants to change the seniority system and appoint his own choice as the president, as the Chief Justice of the court. And this situation where the court has only 13 judges instead of 15 has actually turned the Supreme Court at the moment into a more conservative and non-interventionist court, because the current composition of the court is 6 liberal judges, 6 conservative judges, and 1 leaning conservative sort of swing vote judge. And this is why Levine is blocking any appointment to the Supreme Court. He is willing to appoint judges to lower courts, very low court, magistrate courts, but he is not discussing any appointments to the Supreme Court at the moment, because he wants to fill these 2 vacancies with conservative judges that will, and that will determine, if he succeeds, that will determine the direction of the Supreme Court for generations to come, guaranteeing that the court will almost never intervene in anti-democratic reforms by the government or the Knesset. Let's move to public administration. This is I think there is a consensus in Israel today that the public administration was a colossal failure on October 7th and the months that followed. There is a consensus that public administration has been hollowed out. This didn't happen this year. It happened over a period of time, mostly under Netanyahu governments, Netanyahu coalitions, but it has reached a climax. And I think the result that we are seeing is the failure to provide Israeli citizens, taxpayers, with the critical services that they need and require in this hour of distress. And many of you, I guess, know this because many of you probably donated money for buying socks and underwear to reserve soldiers, or to pay for costs of families that were evacuated from the towns and the kibbutzim around Gaza and in the north to other places and needed immediate financial help. And instead of getting it from the government, they got it from you. And this is amazing and distressing at the same. It's very, very close. This concerns the appointment of the public administration commissioner. I call him the public administration czar, because this guy is basically responsible for hiring, firing, sanctioning approximately 70,000 public employees in the Israeli government. This guy's in charge of the public administration. And this role involves ensuring that the governance of Israel, the public administration, the public service will be professional and will be independent in every way. And this applies to every position, from the top echelons to the lower positions of the government. This is the gatekeeper against cronyism in the public service. Now, the current public service commissioner is Professor Daniel Hershkovitz. He was appointed by Netanyahu 6 years ago, and he's set to retire in September. And this position is a critical gatekeeper. Now, although Hershkovitz was relatively lenient, I would even say sometimes ineffective with appointments, even he had to block numerous crony appointments proposed by some of the ministers in the current government. Again, let's go to one of Netanyahu's government stars, Ben-Gvir. Ben-Gvir's choice of Director General of the Ministry of National Security was found by the Public Administration Commissioner to be unfit for the job, lacking qualifications for the job. He actually stopped, he blocked this appointment. Now, the process of appointing this critical gatekeeper, this appointment czar, is a sad joke. It's amazing. It's amazing. He will be nominated. This is what basically the legal situation says. The Public Administration Commissioner will be nominated by Netanyahu and then appointed by the government. And the only approval required for this job is a committee within the public administration that is led by a chairman who is supposed to be a lawyer, a jurist of some kind. And this lawyer is appointed by the government, by Netanyahu's government. So Netanyahu controls the entire appointment of the person who is supposed to be the gatekeeper of 70,000 appointments in the public service. Now, luckily, 6 years ago, the government agreed to draft an appointment procedure that is supposed to ensure that this role will be filled by a professional, an independent person. But this procedure was never drafted. It was never written. It was never formulated. Surprise. I have to say that thanks to donations from the US, my own research institute, the Brandeis Institute for Society, Economy, and Democracy in the College of Management, is now preparing a petition to the Supreme Court in order to ensure that this procedure will be drafted and there will be at least some process that will ensure that Netanyahu doesn't appoint for this position anyone that he chooses, because this is far too important a gatekeeper to leave for Netanyahu's choice at the moment. Let me give you an anecdotal example of how important it is to appoint serious, independent, and apolitical people to, instead of political cronies, to these kind of jobs. Just 2 weeks ago, one of Israel's leading investigative journalists, Raviv Drucker, exposed recordings of voicemails between Transportation Minister Miri Regev, who's a very close ally of the Netanyahus, actually, and her administration team, including the Director General of the Ministry of Transportation. Now, these recordings included voicemails that were exchanged a few weeks after October 7th, when Minister of Transportation Miri Regev took her team down south to the towns and kibbutzim around Gaza. And in one of the kibbutzim, in Kibbutz Be'eri, which was severely hit by the October 7th attack, the residents of Be'eri that were there blocked the entrance of Miri Regev's van, and they didn't want her in Be'eri because they recalled things that she said about protesters, including people of the kibbutzim during the judicial overhaul. They basically blocked her entrance and asked her to leave. And in this expose, Raviv Drucker broadcasted the voicemail exchange between the general director of the Ministry of Transportation and Regev's team. And you understand that this general director proposes that the Ministry of Transportation will retaliate against the people of Be'eri by stopping all the government contracts with the factory of Kibbutz Be'eri. It's a print factory, and the government is acquiring printed material from that factory. The general director of the Ministry of Transportation proposed a retaliation of that sort. This is the result of corrupting the integrity of the public administration. Let me briefly talk about the second tactic. We talked about appointments so far. Let me talk about something else that the government has been doing for the last few months, and that tactic is simply ignoring the rule of law. What we see, and the Israeli Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara said so to the court, we see more and more cases in which the government simply acts without prior consultation with legal advisors, acts against the law, against the rule of law, and ignores the legal advice, which is legally binding, of the attorney general. And I think what we see in newspapers, in the media, what we see in the public eye is probably the tip of the iceberg of what is really happening. For example, this came up in the crucial issue of drafting yeshiva students to the army. The law that allows, or the laws that were supposed to allow yeshiva students to avoid being drafted to the army expired more than a year ago. And according to this legal situation, it's actually illegal for the state to continue financing the yeshivot for students who are supposed to be drafted by this time. And nevertheless, the government decided to ignore the instructions of the Attorney General that are legally binding, and tried at least to continue funding the yeshivot. And this week, the Attorney General, earlier this week, she made a point of stating before the Supreme Court that this government is consistently disregarding the Attorney General's binding legal advice, and in many cases, not even asking for advice, just acting legally. So let me translate this point to you in simple terms. What we have is an unprecedented situation in which, in the history of Israel, in which the top legal authority within the government is telling us that the government of Israel is disregarding the rule of law. Let's talk about some other important aspects of the judicial overall. Let's talk about freedom of expression. Yesterday, the Israeli District Court approved the government's decision to shut down Al Jazeera broadcasts in Israel, and actually also Al Jazeera offices. So you actually can't access, unless you know how to operate a VPN, you can't access the broadcast of Al Jazeera in Israel, and Al Jazeera is not supposed to broadcast from Israel. The District Court made this decision according to an emergency law that was passed by the Knesset, pushed through by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Communication just recently. And I'm sure no one here is a fan of Al Jazeera, but this law is being challenged in the Supreme Court. And earlier this week, the judges in the Supreme Court commented that that this law may be too extreme in curtailing freedom of speech, and still the government went forward even before this this court discussion and shut down Al Jazeera. And district court reprimanded the government for shutting down Al Jazeera without even hearing Al Jazeera's claims. And so the district court shortened the term of the current order shutting down Al Jazeera from 45 days to 35 days. I'm pretty sure that that this order will be extended eventually. But okay, this is Al Jazeera, right? This is external broadcasts from Qatari governments. Let's talk about demonstrations. Let's talk about the freedom of speech of Israelis in the streets. The Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir, has encouraged the police to be very aggressive against demonstrators protesting against the government, including detaining cases where we know detaining family members of those who were kidnapped to Gaza. Ben-Gvir actually said that he will personally stand by every policeman that will be charged for violence in these protests. However, when ultra-Orthodox worshippers tried to violate strict orders and reach Mount Meron on Lag BaOmer, to reach the celebrations on Mount Meron, risking their lives because Mount Meron is currently bombarded constantly by Hezbollah, and police stopped them, and this resulted in violence. Ben-Gvir personally called the district commissioner at the north of Israel, ordered that these policemen will be immediately removed from active duty, and called, illegally by the way, called the chief of police for a hearing prior dismissal. This was blocked by the attorney general eventually. So it's not surprising that a survey by Channel 12 News last week found that 51% of Israelis think that police under Ben-Gvir is political. And this has consequences in the streets. Finally, let me talk about the fact that the judicial overhaul started with legislation. This legislation is not off the table. Before October 7th, the government advanced at least 225 bills, proposed bills, that political scientists that analyzed those bills deemed them as eroding democracy. Some of these bills actually passed. For example, the amendment to the police ordinance that gives the national security minister a lot of power in actually directing the policy of the police passed and is currently awaiting constitutional judicial review before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court already made some interim decisions saying that they are likely to strike down some or all of this amendments, but they've not given their final ruling on this issue. So some of these laws are actually in force. But since October 7th, the coalition has added approximately 50 more anti-democratic laws to the existing list of 225 that are still on the table. And these laws could be advanced and pushed through the Knesset very quickly if the coalition wants to promote them. I would like to conclude by saying something about the consequences of this democratic backslide as we see it. It's much faster than a sort of slippery slope. What we discussed here is a lot of anecdotes, and you could perhaps maybe explain or justify every specific anecdote on its own. But when you consider all these events together, and I gave you just the tip of the iceberg in that sense, what becomes clear is that Israel is not merely sliding, but rapidly falling down this sharp slope away from democracy. And in the current situation, this has dire consequences. First of all, foreign support. I think there's a serious danger of losing US support, which is critical now for Israel, not only from the Biden administration, but also for more conservative constituencies. I've recently read, I came across an article from a very serious research institute, the Cato Institute in the States, saying that Israel has become a liability for the United States and that the United States should just drop Israel. So this is a very important consequence of the entire scheme of events. The general prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, Karim Khan, commenced a process for issuing international arrest warrants against Netanyahu and against the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes. Now, frankly, the accusations are ridiculous. And international law is, as one of my colleagues says, 95% politics and 5% law. But the ICC is an important body, and the International Court of Justice dealing with genocide, which is also dealing with an Israeli case, is also an important body. Now, the ICC, the one that is supposed to discuss and rule on the request for the issuance of international arrest warrants, operates under the principle that is called in the law the principle of complementarity. Now, that means that the ICC can intervene only if a country cannot or will not investigate its own leaders. Now, if the coalition controls the police, if it controls the judiciary, if it controls public administration, if it controls the media, and it controls the streets, and if Netanyahu's criminal trial is going into its 5th year, and I think we haven't seen even half the way, who will believe that Israel can hold its current leadership to account? If Israel cannot maintain its democratic integrity and hold its leaders to account, which is the case, for example, for Putin's Russia and its invasion to the Ukraine, then the ICC will proceed with issuing arrest warrants against Netanyahu and against Gallant, and Israel is very likely to become a rogue state among the nations. The bottom line is that Israel's democratic backslide was not only one of the triggers that motivated Hamas to attack Israel on October 7th. It is also increasingly reducing the ability of Israel to defend itself, to get support from its allies around the world in the war in Gaza and in the war in the north. And in that sense, it is probably costing the lives of soldiers and of civilians. Let me stop here and take some questions.
Thank you, Ido, for this sobering presentation. If you have questions, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom and put your questions there. We have a few questions. One, maybe technical clarification, Ido. You talked about the Supreme Court not being able to nominate Supreme Court justice, even though the pro-democracy camp has majority in the Judicial Selection Committee, especially after the Israel bar election. Why haven't they been able to push through the judicial nominations, particularly the Chief Justice?
That's a very important clarification. Okay, so first of all, Levine is setting the agenda, so he can prevent a discussion in the appointment of the Chief Justice or the judges. There are various theories about whether the majority, those 6 other members of the committee, can actually impose a change in the agenda. It's not clear. But there's another issue, and that is the fact that Levin controls, as you said, 3 members out of 9. According to Israeli law, in order to appoint a Supreme Court justice, not the lower court, but a justice to the Supreme Court, what you need is a majority of 7 out of 9 in that committee. So by having 3 coalition members with Levin included in the committee, that means Levin has a veto on any appointment that he does not want. And that is what we're actually seeing in the appointments to the Supreme Court.
What actions can the Attorney General take if the government continues to undermine gatekeepers and seek separate legal representations for each matter?
Okay, the power of the Attorney General is actually very limited. She can't really force the hand of the government in any way. She can only basically side with petitioners against the government. This is already happening. Actually, I think in the current coalition, we've broken every record in the history of Israel in cases where the Attorney General is actually siding with petitioners against the side of the government and giving the government the right to private representation in the Supreme Court. Now, the interesting question would be, what happens if the government disobeys the Supreme Court? I don't have a good answer there. Because this would probably bring us to the precipice of a constitutional crisis. And recall that we were very close to this during the judicial overhaul. Somehow the government is managing to avoid this kind of moment.
Thank you. What will happen if the government refuses to obey the Supreme Court's ruling on the IDF drafting law? The government appears to have found workarounds of channeling money to the Haredim despite the prior ruling. Can the Supreme Court issue contempt order, or what significance or effectiveness?
I think this sort of goes back to my previous answer. What we see this government doing is constantly challenging the court in various ways. I don't think the court would issue contempt orders to the government. It's actually, according to the current rulings of the court, it's not even clear if it's possible according to the current law. What I think we will probably see is constant challenges to the Supreme Court with various ways of the government trying to sort of challenge the law, but not break it entirely. And I think current Supreme Court, with its non-interventionist interventionist policy, is going to be probably lenient in one way or another, or respond in a very lax way. Let me give you an example. In 2017. The Supreme Court handed down a very famous decision saying that there is the space for prisoners in Israeli prisons is too small. So small, the areas are so small that it infringes on their dignity. And so the court basically ordered the state to either reduce the number of prisoners or make more bigger cells. And the court gave the government a year and a half to do so. That was in 2017. The government asked for continuance after continuance, and eventually, I think they never complied with the ruling. Every time they cite a different explanation. Sometimes it's a budget, sometimes decisions are taking a long time, sometimes it's a war. What we'll see is more or less the same thing. The government will explain that you can't stop funding yeshiva students all at once. It's going to be gradual. They can't draft all of them together. The government already announced that they can only draft 3,000 out of 65,000 in 2024. What they're probably going to say is that they don't have the budget even for these 3,000. They need to be recruited. They need to be trained. It costs money. So what will actually happen is that the government will say we can't do it immediately, and so we have to fund these students in one way or another and find some way of bypassing the orders of the court without generating much havoc.
What do you say? Democracy only works as long as the government is willing to abide by the law.
Exactly.
Which is a sobering call for what might happen in the US. In the best case scenario, where Netanyahu's government is dismantled, how easy or difficult would it be to repeal the anti-democratic legislation that has been passed?
Okay, this is something I call it the rollback. I think the laws will be the least of our problems. I suspect that the rollback of the laws will be central, for example, in the campaign of the elections whenever they will actually happen. And I think the real challenge will be rebuilding the devastated institutional infrastructure of Israel. My own institute is working with Polish researchers. We're looking at what Poland is doing. As you know, Poland is actually recovering from a democratic backslide, and they're struggling with that now. And I think this will actually be something that will take a lot of time, and there are a lot of long-term challenges, particularly teaching democracy to students. You will probably have 20-25% of the young population in Israel that studied in the private education systems of the ultra-Orthodox parties that have no idea what democracy means. I'm not sure that the rest of the 70% of the students in Israel have an idea of what democracy means, considering who controls the education system at the moment. But this will be a big challenge long term in actually not just rolling back, but maintaining Israeli democracy for a while.
Can the Supreme Court justices reverse their decision to allow an indicted prime minister to continue serving as a prime minister, given all that has transpired with Netanyahu?
Short answer, no. There were actually several petitions that tried in various very original ideas and theories to have the court disqualify or remove Netanyahu from office in one way or another. They were all shut down very quick. All these petitions were shut down very quickly by the Supreme Court. In order to remove Netanyahu or actually guarantee that someone with a criminal trial not become prime minister, the law has to be changed. The court can't do that.
The anti-democratic legislation encompasses many aspects of life. What is the most vulnerable area where the pro-overall camp stands to gain the most?
For the pro-overall camp, okay. Well, this is a difficult question. My answer would be that actually weakening the court and the gatekeepers enables the pro-overall camp to do anything they want, allocate budgets. You know, we were talking about legal issues here, but budgets are so important. Today, the Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, lashed at his gatekeepers for intervening with government decisions. He's been doing this for quite a while, and he's been channeling budgets to his own constituency, preferring them over other constituencies and general public interest sometimes. So if you manage to reduce any checks and balances, which is the basic idea of the judicial overall, you can allocate budgets to constituencies, you can appoint cronies, you can evade criminal justice, and essentially you can plunder the state for your own benefit. And I think this is why it was so important for Levine to fight and continue fighting for the fundamental pillars of the overall. This is the biggest achievement.
Final couple of questions. Why is the Histadrut, the labor union, still sitting on the fence and doesn't get involved with the protest?
You know, we all think about the Histadrut as kind of a left-wing, entity born from unify the labor, Marxist ideas. Many unions of the Histadrut today, the most powerful unions in the Histadrut. I mean, the Histadrut is a combination of all the unions of employees in Israel, the unionized employees in Israel. Many of those are actually captured by the Likud. It would be inaccurate to think of them as kind of left-wing, necessarily pro-liberal organization. Let me give you an example. One of the most important ministers in the government is Chaim Katz, the Minister of Tourism. He's also the chairman of the center of the Likud, and he used to be the chairman of the union of the employees of the aviation industry, Atasiya Avirit, and now his son is the chairman of this union. This is an extremely powerful union, so obviously this is critical.
Final two questions by Yoel and Gabriel. The first one is, do you see a light at the end of this dark tunnel? Should not the anti-judicial coup pre-October 7 demonstrator enter the political fray? And the second question is, what can we do to support the pro-democracy Israeli protest from the US?
First of all, you have to be optimistic. You have to see a light at the end of the tunnel. And I am sure that in one way or another, what you will see is that the pro-democracy camp will advance in various ways. It will be in politics. I'm sure. I know. I attend various meetings of activists that have the intention of entering politics at a certain stage when elections will be relevant. So I think we're going to see that. But I think what we're going to see in addition, and this is a wonderful thing that has happened to Israel, and that is that people are taking to the streets. People understand that these are crucial moments for the existence of Israel, for the existence of Israeli democracy. I mean, the entire existence of the state of Israel, its inception was based on democratic ideas. The Supreme Court has ruled that the two fundamental ideas of the state of Israel are its democratic and its Jewish principles. So this is what we signed up for, and this is what people are fighting for. And I think in that sense, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. What you can do from the U.S. First of all, I think there's a lot of activism that needs to be done from the U.S. Protests in the U.S. matter. I know from talking to a lot of friends in the U.S. that there is a problematic atmosphere for Israelis and Jews in the U.S. And I think changing everything will also improve the problematic atmosphere the anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic atmosphere that's sort of bubbling in the United States and in other places around the globe at the moment. I think it's important. I think we're obviously, in one way or another, we're tied. Israel and the Israeli and Jewish community in the United States, despite the fact that a lot of people that I know of in the United States feel like Israel is something that, okay, let's leave them alone and let them get their act together and then we'll talk. Support for Israel is really important. Donations are also important. I've met, just this week, I met with a lot of people that are donating to various actions and activities and protests, and this is very important because obviously the pro overall campaign is getting support from its own financing network, and this is going to be a very important fight, and the financial part of the fight is important as well.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. I apologize for those questions that we weren't able to answer. I'm going to send them to Ido, and if you guys, Gabriel and if you email me, we'll connect you with them. Thank you, Ido, and here for happy days.
Thank you so much for having me.